on task with it, and I'm hoping that this does work out pretty good. Let me see what we got here. Yeah, it's still not moving. I don't know. Okay, so while I'm waiting for my delay to, because I've got it on delay, I'm gonna go ahead and tell you guys. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the strange, the bizarre, the unusual. I like it. This is Roger Hanson, and I'm here to bring you another story. Before I get started, I'd like to mention to everybody, too, that the strange, the bizarre, and the unusual is completely and 100% organic. We are an organic channel as well as group and pages, or groups and pages on both Google Plus, Facebook, and on Minds.com. Now, what I mean by organic is that we do not pay for subscribers and we do not pay for reach or views. We are 100% organic, and we actually take pride in that. So, with that said, I'd like to say if you guys would like to subscribe, and make comments, it would be greatly appreciated. That helps us out, and especially with the comments, make comments, and every time you do, I'll do my best to respond to them. And we thank you for all your support in that way, and that's the best way you can help us out. After that, I'd like to also mention that with YouTube and their new monetization rules, we've decided that if you need subscribers and you want us to subscribe to you, please, or just subscribe to our channel publicly so that we can tell that you have subscribed to us, because if you do it privately, we can't see who's subscribed to us. So do it publicly, and we would be more than happy to return the favor. And like I said, if you don't do it publicly, then I won't know who it is that's subscribed to me, and I can't subscribe back. So remember to subscribe publicly. Now, with that said, I can get on to the story that I was going to bring to you. Here recently, I've been doing stories concerning the concerning the Book of Gates, and so far I've gotten through divisions of the Tuat, divisions 1 through 3, and I also did the small summary that came before that, and in another book I did Preparatio Evangelica, book 1. So after that, I figured I would go into telling the story of Hypatia before I continue, because this is all part of my series, the mystery, or the history of the mystery schools. And for me personally, I don't think that telling the story without mentioning Hypatia would really work out too well, because Hypatia is actually a part of that. A lot of this sets up the atmosphere for later, and the reasons behind why the mystery schools influenced a lot of the hermetic beliefs that happened during the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages and all that. So these are philosophies that are really, really old, and they influenced the way the Hermetic beliefs and traditions actually started. So, with that being said, I will start my story on Hypatia. Hypatia was born 350 to 370 AD and died in 415 AD. And she was a Hellenistic Neoplatonist philosopher, astronomer, and mathematician who lived in Alexandria, Egypt, then part of the Eastern Roman Empire. She was the head of the Neoplatonic school at Alexandria, where she taught philosophy and astronomy. She is the first female mathematician whose life is reasonably well recorded. Hypatia was renowned in her own lifetime as a great teacher and wise counselor. Although no writings directly written by her have survived, it is thought that she may have edited the surviving text of Euclid's Elements and Ptolemy's Almagest, and possibly co-written some of the commentaries attributed to her father, Theon of Alexandria, who also wrote a 13-volume commentary on Diophantus's Arithmetica, which may survive in part, having been interpolated into Diophantus's original text, and an 8-volume popularization of Apollonius of Pergas's treatise on conic sections, which has not survived. She is known to have constructed astrolabes and hydrometers, but did not invent either of these, which were both in use long before she was born. Although she herself was a pagan, she was tolerant towards Christians and taught many Christian students, including Synesius, the future bishop of Ptolemais. Towards the end of her life, Hypatia advised Orestes, the Roman prefect of Alexandria, who was in the midst of a feud with Cyril, the bishop of Alexandria. Rumors spread accusing her of preventing Orestes from reconciling with Cyril, and in March 415 AD she was murdered by a mob of Christian monks known as the Parabellari, under the leadership of a lector named Peter. Hypatia's death shocked the empire and transformed her into a martyr for philosophy, leading future Neoplatonists such as Damascus to become increasingly fervent in their opposition of Christianity. During the Middle Ages, Hypatia was co-opted as a symbol of Christian virtue, and scholars believe she was part of the basis for the legend of Saint Catherine of Alexandria. During the Age of Enlightenment, she became a symbol of opposition to Catholicism. In the 19th century, European literature, especially Charles Kingsley's 1853 novel Hypatia, romanticized her as the last of the Hellenists. In the 20th century, Hypatia became seen as an icon for women's rights and a precursor for the feminist movement. Since the last 20th century, some portrayals have associated Hypatia's death with the burning of the Library of Alexandria, despite the historical fact that the library no longer existed during Hypatia's lifetime. Hypatia was the daughter of the mathematician Theon of Alexandria, who lived from 335 to 405 AD. Nothing whatsoever is known about Hypatia's mother, who is never mentioned in any of the extant sources. Theon dedicated his commentary on Book 4 of Ptolemy's Almagest to an individual named Epiphanius, addressing him as "my dear son," indicating that he may have been Hypatia's brother. But the Greek word theon uses teknon does not always mean son in the biological sense, and was often used merely to signal strong feelings of paternal connection. Hypatia's exact year of birth is still under debate, with suggested dates ranging from 350 to 370 AD. Many scholars have followed Richard Hawke in inferring that Hypatia was born around 370. According to the Suda, she flourished in the reign of Arcadius. Hawke reasoned that Damascius's description of her physical beauty would imply that she was at most 30 at that time, and the year 370 was 30 years prior to the midpoint of Arcadius's reign. In contrast, theories that she was born as early as 350 are based on the wording of John Malalas, who calls her old at the time of her death in 415. Robert Pinella argues that both theories are weakly based and that her birth date should be left unspecified. Theon was the head of a school called the Museion, Mousseion, which was named in emulation of the Hellenistic Museion, whose membership has ceased in the 260s AD. Theon's school was exclusive, highly prestigious, and doctrinally conservative. Theon rejected the teachings of Lamlichus and may have taken pride in teaching a pure Plotinian Neoplatonism. He wanted his daughter to be a perfect human being. He taught Hypatia mathematics, philosophy, and astronomy, trained her in the art of rhetoric, had her read classic literature, and devised a physical exercise routine involving running, hiking, horseback riding, rowing, and swimming to keep her physically fit. For further study, he sent her to Italy and Athens. In Athens, she studied under Plutarch of Athens and his daughter Asclepigia. After returning to Alexandria, Hypatia lectured and wrote about mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and mechanics. She was a Neoplatonist, but, like her father, she rejected the teachings of Lambichus and instead embraced the original Neoplatonism formulated by Plotinus. She was a mathematician and philosophy instructor at the Neoplatonist school in Alexandria, and in around 400 she became the director of the school. The Alexandrian school was renowned at the time for its philosophy, and Alexandria was regarded as second only to Athens as the philosophical capital of the Greco-Roman world. Hypatia taught students from all over the Mediterranean. According to the Neoplatonist historian Damascius, 458 to 538, she lectured on the writings of Plato and Aristotle. He also states that she walked through Alexandria in a philosopher's cloak, giving impromptu public lectures. Damascius writes that Hypatia was exceedingly beautiful and fair of form, but nothing else is known regarding her physical appearance, and no ancient depictions of her have survived. The Christian historian Socrates of Constantinople, and contemporary of Hypatia, describes her in his eschatological history, focusing on her personality rather than her appearance. There was a woman at Alexandria named Hypatia, daughter of the philosopher Theon, who made such attainments in literature and science as so far surpass all the philosophers of her own time. Having succeeded to the school of Plato and Plotinus, she explained the principles of philosophy to her auditors, many of whom came from the distance to receive her instructions. On account of the self-possession and ease of manner which she had acquired in consequence of the cultivation of her mind, she not infrequently appeared in public in the presence of the magistrates. Neither did she feel abashed in going to an assembly of men, for all men, on account of her extraordinary dignity and virtue, admired her the more. Damascius states that Hypatia remained a lifelong virgin, and that when one of the men who came to her lectures tried to court her, she tried to soothe his lust by playing the lyre. When he refused to abandon his pursuit, she rejected him outright, displaying her bloody menstrual rags and declaring, "This is what you really love, my young man, but you do not love beauty for its own sake." Damascius further relates that the young man was so traumatized that he abandoned his desire for her immediately. Michael A. B. Deacon argues that Hypatia's menstruations was proof of her celibacy, since in ancient times monarchy generally occurred around the time a woman reached marriage age, much later than in developed countries today. And since no reliable methods of birth control existed, menstruations would have actually been relatively rare occurrence for any woman who was not devoted to a life of celibacy. Two main varieties of Neoplatonism were taught in Alexandria during the late 4th century. The first was the overly pagan religious Neoplatonism taught at the Serapeum, which was greatly influenced by the teachings of Lamblichus. The second variety was the more moderate and less polemical variety championed by Hypatia and her father, Theon, which was based on the teachings of Plotinus. Although Hypatia herself was pagan, she was tolerant of Christians. In fact, every one of her known students was Christians. One of her most prominent pupils was Synesius of Cyrene, who went on to become a bishop of Ptolemais, now in eastern Libya, in 410. Afterwards, he continued to exchange letters with Hypatia, and his extant letters are the main sources of information about her career. 7 letters by Synesius to Hypatia have survived, but none from her addressed to him are extant. From 382 to 412, the Bishop of Alexandria was Theophilus. Theophilus was militantly opposed to Lamblichian Neoplatonism, and in 391 he demolished the Serapeum. Despite this, Theophilus tolerated Hypatia's school and seems to have regarded Hypatia as his ally. Theophilus supported the bishopric of Hypatia's pupil Synesius, who describes Theophilus in his letters with love and admiration. Theophilus also permitted Hypatia herself to establish close relations with the Roman prefects and other prominent political leaders. Partly as a result of Theophilus's tolerance, Hypatia became extremely popular with the people of Alexandria and exerted profound political influence. Theophilus died unexpectedly in 412. He had been training his nephew Cyril, but had not officially named him as his successor. The violent power struggle over the diocese broke out between Cyril and his rival Timothy. Cyril won and immediately began to punish those who had supported Timothy. He closed the churches of Timothy's supporters, the Novatianists, and confiscated their property. Hypatia's school seems to have immediately taken a strong distrust towards the new bishop, as evidenced by the fact that all of his vast correspondences, Synesius only ever wrote one letter to Cyril in which he treats the younger bishop as unexperienced and misguided. In a letter written to Hypatia in 413, Synesius requests her to intercede on behalf of 2 individuals impacted by the ongoing civil strife of Alexandria, insisting, "You always have power, and you can bring about good by using that power." He also reminds her that she had taught him that a Neoplatonic philosopher must introduce the higher moral standards of political life and act for the benefit of his or her fellow citizens. In 414, Cyril closed all the synagogues in Alexandria, confiscating all the property belonging to the Jews and expelling all of the Jews from the city. Orestes, the Roman prefect of Alexandria, who was also a close friend of Hypatia and a recent convert to Christianity, was outraged by Cyril's actions and sent a scathing report to the emperor. The conflict escalated and a riot broke out in which Parabellani, Pelabellani, in which the Parabellani, a group of monks under Cyril's authority, nearly killed Orestes. As punishment, Orestes had Ammonius, the monk who had started the riot, publicly tortured to death. Cyril tried to proclaim Ammonius a martyr, but Christians in Alexandria were disgusted, since Ammonius had been killed for inciting a riot and attempting to murder the governor, not for his faith. Prominent Alexandrian Christians intervened and forced Orestes and Cyril to come to an uneasy truce. During the negotiations, Orestes frequently consulted Hypatia for advice, because she was well liked among both pagans and Christians alike. She had not been involved in any previous stages of the conflict, and she had an impeccable reputation as a wise counselor. Despite Hypatia's popularity, Cyril and his allies attempted to discredit her and undermine her reputation. Socrates Scholasticus mentions rumors accusing Hypatia of preventing Orestes from reconciling with Cyril. Traces of other rumors that spread among the Christian populace of Alexandria may be found in the writings of 7th century Egyptian Coptic bishop John of Nicaea, who alleges in his chronicles that Hypatia had engaged in satanic practices and had intentionally hampered the church's influence over Orestes. And in those days there appeared in Alexandria a female philosopher, a pagan named Hypatia, and she was devoted at all times to magic, astrolabes, and instruments of music, and she beguiled many people through her satanic wiles, and the governor of the city honored her exceedingly, for she had beguiled him through her magic, and he ceased attending church as had been his custom. And he not only did this, but he drew many believers to her, and he himself received the unbeliever at his house. During the Christian festival of Lent in March 415, the Parabellani, under the leadership of a lector named Peter, raided Hypatia's carriage as she was traveling home. They dragged her into a nearby church known as the Caesareum, where they stripped her naked and murdered her using ostrakos and nylon, which can either be translated as roof tiles or oyster shells. They tore her body into pieces and dragged her mangled limbs through the town to a place called Cenarion, where they set them on fire. Socrates Scholasticus presents Hypatia's murder as entirely politically motivated and makes no mention of any role that Hypatia's paganism might have played in her death. Instead, He reasons that she fell a victim to the political jealousy which at the time prevailed, for as she had frequent interviews with Orestes, it was calumnia, uh, calum, calumniously reported among the Christian populace that it was she who prevented Orestes from being reconciled to the bishops. Socrates Scholasticus condemns the actions of the mob and declares that surely nothing can be farther from the spirit of Christianity than the allowance of massacres, fights, and transactions of that sort. Among modern historians, Hypatia's death is usually either blamed on Cyril of Alexandria's jealousy, cast as a side event in the power struggle between Cyril and Orestes, or interpreted as a violent manifestation of the pre-existing turmoil in Alexandria. Modern historians still debate whether and to what extent Cyril may have been involved in the incident. Many historians consider it likely that Cyril at least had some prior knowledge of the murder, but a minority argue that he was totally uninvolved. Hypatia's death sent shockwaves through the empire. For centuries, philosophers have been seen as effectively untouchable during the displays of public violence that sometimes occurred in Roman cities, and the murder of a female philosopher at the hands of a mob was seen as profoundly dangerous and destabilizing. Although no concrete evidence was ever discovered definitively linking Cyril to the murder of Hypatia, it was widely believed that he had ordered it. Even if Cyril had not directly ordered the murder himself, it was self-evident that his smear campaign against Hypatia had inspired it. The Alexandrian council was alarmed at Cyril's conduct and sent an embassy to the First Council of Constantinople, which appointed Alexandrian patriarchs Theodosius as advisors, launched an investigation to determine Cyril's role in the murder. The investigation resulted in the Parabolani being removed from Cyril's power and instead placed under the authorities of Orestes. Cyril himself allegedly only managed to escape even more serious punishment by bribing one of Theodosius II's officials. Historian Edward J. Watts argues that Hypatia's murder was the turning point in Cyril's fight to gain political control of Alexandria. Hypatia had been the linchpin holding Orestes' opposition against Cyril together, and without her the opposition quickly collapsed. 2 years later, Cyril overturned the law, placing the Parabolanians under Orestes' control, and by the early 420s, Cyril had come to dominate the Alexandrian council. Hypatia has been described as a universal genius, but she was probably more of a teacher and commentator than an innovator. No evidence has been found that Hypatia ever published any independent work or philosophy, and she does not appear to have made any groundbreaking mathematical discoveries. During Hypatia's time period, scholars preserved classic mathematical works and commented on them to develop their arguments rather than publishing original work. It has also been suggested that the closure of the Mauseion of and the destruction of the Serapeum may have led Hypatia and her father to focus their efforts on preserving seminal mathematical books and making them accessible to their students. The Suda, a 10th century AD Byzantine encyclopedia, mistakenly states that all of Hypatia's writings have been lost, but modern scholarship has identified several works by her as extant. This kind of authorial uncertainty is typical of female philosophers from antiquity. Hypatia wrote in Greek, which was the language spoken by most educated people in the eastern Mediterranean at the time. In classical antiquity, astronomy was seen as being essentially mathematical in character. Furthermore, no distinction was made between mathematics and numerology or astronomy and astrology. It is possible that Hypatia may have edited her father's commentary on Euclid's Elements. Her father mentions the manuscript as being the recension of my philosopher daughter Hypatia, though it is not clear whether she edited or revised her father's work or indeed authored any part of it. Theon also edited the existing version of Euclid's Elements, correcting scribal errors that had been made over the course of nearly 700 years of copying, and Hypatia is believed to have assisted him. Theon and Hypatia's edition of Euclid's Elements became the most widely used edition of the textbook for centuries, and almost totally supplanted all other editions. Hypatia may have also edited the existing version of Ptolemy's Almagest. It was once thought that Hypatia had merely revised Theon's commentary on Almagest based on the title of Theon's commentary on the third book of Almagest, which reads, Commentary of Theon of Alexandria of Book 3 of Ptolemy's Almagest. Edition revised by my daughter Hypatia the philosopher, but based on the analysis of the titles of Theon's other commentaries, the similar titles from the time period, scholars have concluded that Hypatia corrected not her father's commentary, but the text of Almagest itself. Her contribution is thought to be an improved method for the long division algorithms needed for astronomical computation. The Ptolemaic model of the universe was geocentric, meaning it taught that the sun revolved around the earth. In the Almagest, Ptolemy proposed a division problem for calculating the number of degrees swept out by the sun in a single day as it orbits the earth. In his early commentary, Theon had tried to improve upon Ptolemy's division calculation. In the text edited by Hypatia, a tabular method is detailed. This tabular method might be the astronomical table which historic sources attribute to Hypatia. Hypatia wrote a commentary on Diophantus's 13-volume Arithmetica, which had been written circa 250. It set out more than 100 mathematical problems for which solutions are proposed using algebra. It was long believed that this commentary had been lost, but the 19th century scholar Paul Tannery deducted that parts of it had actually survived, interpolated into Diophantus's original text, of which only volume 1 through 6 have survived. Sir Thomas Heath published the first English translation of the surviving portion of the Arithmetica in 1885. Heath argued that surviving text of the first of Arithmetica is actually a redaction produced by Hypatia to aid her students. Hypatia used an unusual algorithm for division in the then standard sexagesimal numeral system, making it easy for scholars to pick out which part of the text she had written. Hypatia also wrote an 8-volume popularization of Apollonius of Pargas's work on conic sections, which is no longer extant. She also created an astronomical canon, a set of tables describing the movements of the heavenly bodies. This is believed to have been either a new edition of the handy tablets by the Alexandrian Ptolemy or the aforementioned commentary of his Almagest. A high degree of mathematical accomplishments would have been needed to comment on Apollonius's advanced mathematics or the astronomical canons. Because of this, most scholars today recognize that Hypatia must have been among the leading mathematicians of her day. One of Synesius's letters describe Hypatia as having taught him how to construct a silver plane astrolabe as a gift for an official. An astrolabe is a device used to calculate date and time based on the position of the stars and planets. It can also be used to predict where the stars and planets will be on any given date. A little astrolabe or plane astrolabe is a kind of astrolabe that uses stereographic projections of the celestial sphere to represent the heavens on a plane surface, as opposed to an armillary sphere, which was globe-shaped. The statement for Synesius's letter has sometimes been wrongly interpreted by means that Hypatia invented the plane astrolabe herself, but the plane astrolabe is known to have been in use at least 500 years before Hypatia was born. Hypatia probably learned how to construct a plane astrolabe from her father, Theon, who had written a treatise on it. Theon's treatise is now lost, but its translations are credited with having transmitted the theoretical concept of plane astrolabes to the Arabic world, and part of it may be preserved in the writings of Severus Sabacht. Synesius's writings reflect the Neoplatonist belief that knowledge of the divine is attainable through observing the heavens. In another letter, Synesius requests Hypatia to construct him a hydroscope, a device not known as a device now known as a hydrometer, to determine the density or specific gravity of liquids. Based on this request, it has been claimed that Hypatia invented the hydrometer herself, but the minute detail in which Synesius describes the instrument indicates that he assumes she has never heard of the device, but trusts she will be able to replicate it based on the verbal description. The invention of other devices, including a device for removing salt from seawater and a device to measure the level of water, have also been attributed to Hypatia. These other attributions may largely be discounted as spurious. Ari Bellingsley describes Hypatia's astronomical work as pivotal for the politics of the region, focusing on controversies related to observation of the equinox and the timing of festivals, ultimately serving to highlight errors in Ptolemy's work and the need for independent observation. In two consecutive works, 2010-2016, Bellingsley proposed an astronomical calendrical paradigm for Hypatia's murder, comparing two principal sources on Hypatia of Socrates, Scholasticus, and Philostorgius. Bellingsley suggested that Hypatia carried out equinoctial observations in 414 and 415, initiated on the request of the governor Orestes. This could have been the litmus test of who was right in the conflicts over the 414 Easter day waged by Cyril, the bishop of the Alexandrian Church, with the local Jewish and Novatian communities. Hypatia's success in establishing the correct day of the vernal equinox could undermine the Alexandrian Church authority in the timing of Easter, as it used equinoctial computations based on Ptolemy's syntaxis. Almagest. Hypatia had no appointed successor, no spouse, and no offspring, and her sudden death not only left her legacy unprotected, but also triggered a backlash against her entire ideology. Hypatia, with her tolerance towards Christian students and her willingness to cooperate with Christian leaders, had hoped to establish a precedent that Neoplatonism and Christianity could coexist peacefully and cooperatively. Instead, her death and the subsequent failure of the Christian government to impose justice on her killers destroyed the notion entirely and led future Neoplatonists such as Damascius to consider Christian bishops as dangerous, jealous figures who were also utterly unphilosophical. Hypatia became seen as a martyr of philosophy, and her murder led philosophers to adopt attitudes that increasingly emphasized the pagan aspects of their belief systems. and helped create a sense of identity for philosophers as pagan traditionalists set apart from the Christian masses. Shortly after Hypatia's murder, a forged anti-Christian letter appeared under her name. Damascus was anxious to exploit the scandal of Hypatia's death and attributed responsibility for her murder to Bishop Cyril and his Christian followers. A passage from Damascus's Life of Isidore, preserved in the Suda, concludes that Hypatia's murder was due to Cyril's envy over the wisdom exceeding all bounds, and especially in the things concerning astronomy. Damascus accounts of the Christian murder of Hypatia is sole historical source, attributing direct responsibility to Bishop Cyril. At the same time, Damascus was not entirely kind to Hypatia either. He characterized her as nothing more than a wandering cynic, and compares her favorably with his own teacher, Isidore of Alexandria, remarking that Isidorus greatly outshone Hypatia, not just as a man does over a woman, but in the way a genuine philosopher will over a mere geometer. Hypatia's death was similar to those of Christian martyrs in Alexandria who had been dragged through the streets during the Decian persecutions in 250. Other aspects of Hypatia's life also fit the mold for a Christian martyr, especially her lifelong virginity. In the early Middle Ages, Christians conflated Hypatia's death with stories of the Decian martyrs, and she became part of the basis for the legend of Saint Catherine of Alexandria, a virgin martyr said to have been exceedingly wise and well educated. The earliest attestation for the cult of virgin martyr said to have been the earliest attestation for the cult of Saint Catherine comes from the 8th century, around 300 years after Hypatia's death. One story tells of Saint Catherine being confronted by 15 pagan philosophers seeking to convert her, but instead converting all of them to Christianity through her eloquence. Another legend claims that Saint Catherine had been a student of Athanasius of Alexandria. Legends about Hypatia's possible marriage are discussed in the 10th century Byzantine Suda encyclopedia, which states that Hypatia was the wife of Isidore the philosopher, apparently Isidore of Alexandria. However, Isidore of Alexandria was not born until long after Hypatia's death, and no other philosopher of that name contemporary with Hypatia is known. The intellectual Eudokia Macrombolitisa from 1021 to 1096, the second wife of Byzantine Emperor Constantine X. Ducas, was described by the historian Nicephorus Gregoris as a second Hypatia. The early 18th century Deist scholar John Toland used the murder of Hypatia as the basis for the anti-Catholic tract Hypatia, or the history of the most beautiful, most virtuous, most learned, and every way accomplished lady who was torn to pieces by the clergy of Alexandria to gratify the pride, emulation, and cruelty of their archbishop, commonly but undeservedly stilt Saint Cyril, in order to portray Hypatia's death in the worst possible light. Toland changed the story and invented elements not found in any of the ancient sources. In 1721, Thomas Lewis wrote a response defending Cyril entitled The History of Hypatia, a most impudent school mistress of Alexandria, murdered and torn to pieces by the populace, in defense of Saint Cyril and the Alexandrian clergy from the aspersions of Mr. Toland. Lewis rejected Damascus's account as unreliable, out of hand, on the account of the fact that its author was a heathen, and then proceeded to argue that Socrates, Scholasticus, was a Puritan who was consistently biased against Cyril. Voltaire, in his Examen important de Millard Bolingbroke ou le tombeau de Fantisme in 1736, interpreted Hypatia as a believer in the laws of rational nature and the capacities of the human mind, free of dogmas, and described her death as a bestial murder perpetrated by Cyril's tinctures hounds with a fanatical gang at their heels. Later, in an entry for his Dictionnaire philosophique in 1772, Voltaire again portrayed Hypatia as a free-thinking, deistic genius brutally murdered by ignorant and misunderstanding Christians. Most of the entry ignores Hypatia herself altogether, and instead deals with the controversy over whether or not Cyril was responsible for her death. Voltaire concludes with the snide remark that when one strips beautiful women naked, it is not to massacre them. In his monumental work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, the English historian Edward Gibbon expanded on Toland and Voltaire's misleading portrayals by declaring Cyril as the sole cause of all evil in Alexandria at the beginning of the 5th century, and construing Hypatia's murder as evidence to support his polemical thesis that the rise of Christianity was the sole cause of the Roman Empire's decline. He remarks on Cyril's continued veneration as a Christian saint, commenting that superstition Christianity perhaps would more gently expiate the blood of a virgin than the banishment of a saint. In response to these accusations, Catholic authors, as well as some French Protestants, insisted with increasing vehemence of Cyril had absolutely no involvement in Hypatia's murder, and that Peter the lector was solely responsible. In the course of these heated debates, Hypatia herself tended to be cast aside and ignored, while the debates focused far more intently on the question of whether Peter the lector had acted alone or under Cyril's orders. In 19th century Europe, library authors spun the legend of Hypatia as part of Neo-Hellenism, a movement that romanticized ancient Greeks and their values. Interest on the literary legend of Hypatia began to rise. Deodata Saluzzo Roro's 1827 Hypatia o Zero della Philosophy suggests that Cyril had actually converted Hypatia to Christianity and that she had been killed by a treacherous priest. In his 1852 Hypatia and 1853 Hypatie et Cyril, French poet Charles Leconte de Lasalle portrayed Hypatia as the epitome of vulnerable truth and beauty. Leconte de Lasalle's first poem portrayed Hypatia as a woman born after her time, a victim of the laws of history. His second poem reverted back to the 18th century deistic portrayal of Hypatia as the victim of Christian brutality, but with the twist that Hypatia tries and fails to convince Cyril that Neoplatonism and Christianity are actually fundamentally the same. Charles Kingsley's 1853 novel Hypatia, or New Foes with an Old Face, was originally intended as a historical treatise, but instead became a typical mid-Victorian romance with a militantly anti-Catholic message, portraying Hypatia as a helpless, pretentious, and erotic heroine with the spirit of Plato and the body of Aphrodite. Kingsley's novel was tremendously popular. It was translated into several European languages and remained continuously in print for the rest of the century. It promoted the romantic visions of Hypatia as the last of the Hellenists and was quickly adapted into a broad variety of stage productions, the first of which was a play written by Elizabeth Bowers, performed in Philadelphia in 1859, starring the writer herself in the titular role. On January the 2nd, 1893, a much higher profile stage played adaptation Hypatia, written by G. Stewart Orgolevy and produced by Herbert Beerbohm Tree, opened at the Haymarket Theatre in London. The title role was initially played by Julia Nelson, and it featured an elaborate musical score written by the composer Hubert Parry. The novel also spawned works of visual art, including in 1867 portrait of Hypatia as a young woman by the early photographer Julian Margaret Cameron, and in 1855 painted by Charles William Mitchell, showing a nude Hypatia standing before an altar in a church. All the same time, European philosophers and scientists described Hypatia as the last representation of science and free inquiry before a long medieval decline. In 1843, German authors Soldan and Heppe argued that their highly influential history of the witchcraft trials that Hypatia may have been, in effect, the first famous witch punished under Christian authority. As an astronomer, Hypatia was honored when two 38, Hypatia, a main belt asteroid discovered in 1884, was named for her. The lunar crater Hypatia was also named for her, in addition to craters named for her father, Theon, in the 118 kilometer Ramée Hypatia are located north of the crater 1 degree south of the equator along the Mare Tranquillitatis. In the 20th century, Hypatia's life and death was cast in the light of women's rights, and she was adopted by feminists. The author Carlo Pascal claimed in 1908 that her murder was an anti-feminist act and brought about a change in the treatment of women as well as the decline of the Mediterranean civilization in general. Dora Russell, the wife of Bertrand Russell, published a book on the inadequate education of women in inequality with the title Hypatia, or Women of and Knowledge, in 1925. The prologue explains why she chose the title. Hypatia was a university lecturer denounced by church dignitaries and torn to pieces by Christians. Such will probably be the fate of this book. Hypatia's death became symbolic for some historians. For example, Kathleen Wider proposed that the murder of Hypatia marked the end of classical antiquity, and Stephen Greenblatt observed that her murder effectively marked the downfall of Alexandrian intellectual life. On the other hand, Christian Wildberg notes that Hellenistic philosophy continued to flourish in the 5th and 6th centuries, and perhaps until the age of Justinian. The 13th and final episode of Carl Sagan's 1980 PBS series Cosmos, A Personal Voyage, relates a heavily fictionalized retelling of Hypatia's death, which results in the Great Library of Alexandria being burned by militant Christians. In actuality, though, Christians led by Theophilus did indeed burn the Serapeum in 391 AD. The Library of Alexandria had already ceased to exist in any recognizable form centuries prior to Hypatia's birth. As an intellectual woman, Hypatia became a role model for modern intelligent women, and 2 feminist journals were named after her. The Greek journal Hypatia Feminist Studies was launched in Athens in 1984, and Hypatia, the Journal of Feminist Philosophy, was launched in the United States in 1986. In the United Kingdom, the Hypatia Trust has compiled a library and archive of feminine library, artistics, and scientific works since 1996. An extension of the trust has established the Hypatia in the Woods retreat in Washington State, where artistic, business, and academic women can spend time to work on projects. Judy Chicago's large-scale art piece, The Dinner Party, awards Hypatia a place setting. Major works of 20th century literature contain references to Hypatia, including Marcel Proust's story Madame Swann at home and within a budding grove, from In Search of Lost Time and Latin Pierce's The Dream of Scipio. Hypatia's life continues to be fictionalized by authors in many countries and languages. In Umberto Eco's 2002 novel, Baldolino, the hero falls in love with a half-satyr, half-woman who is descended from a group of Hypatia's young female disciples who fled after their teacher's murder. These disciples set up a female-only community who tried to keep alive what they had learned from their mistress, living apart from the world to rediscover what Hypatia had really said. All the women who reproduced by fecundation with satyrs are named Hypatia and are collectively known as Hypatias. Charlotte Kramer's 2006 novel Holy Murder, The Death of Hypatia of Alexandria portrays Cyril as an archetypal archetypal villain without an ounce of good. Hypatia is repeatedly described as brilliant and beloved, and she humiliates Cyril by demonstrating that she knows more about Christian scripture than he does. Kai Longfellow's novel Flow Down Like Silver in 2009 invents an elaborate backstory for why Hypatia first started teaching. Yusuf Zaidan's novel Azazel in 2012 describes Hypatia's brutal murder through the eyes of the monk Hypa, who witnesses the incident. In The Plot to Save Socrates in 2006 by Paul Levinson, and its sequels Unburning Alexandria Novelette 2008, Novel 13, and Chronica, Hypatia turns out to have been a time traveler from the 21st century United States. The 2009 movie Agora, directed by Alejandro Amenabar and starring Rachel Weisz as Hypatia, is a heavily fictionalized dramatization of Hypatia's final years. The film, which was intended to criticize contemporary Christian fundamentalism, has had wide-ranging impact on the popular conception of Hypatia. Unlike previous fictional adaptations, Agora emphasizes Hypatia's astronomical and mechanical studies rather than her philosophy, portraying her as less Plato than Copernicus. It also, more than any other previous portrayal, emphasizes the restrictions imposed on women by the early Christian church. In one scene, Hypatia is sexually assaulted by one of her father's slaves who has recently converted to Christianity, and in another scene, Cyril reads a verse from 1 Timothy 2:8-12 forbidding women from teaching. Near the end of the film, Synesius warns Orestes that he must abandon his friendship with Hypatia in order to retain his faith as a Christian. The film also portrays Searle as his monk as swarthy, bearded men with covered heads, clad in tattered black clothing, resembling media portrayals of the Taliban. The film, however, also contains numerous historical inaccuracies. It inflates Hypatia's achievements and incorrectly portrays her as having discovered proof to support Aristarchus of Samos' heliocentric models of the universe, for which there is no evidence that Hypatia ever studied. It also contains a scene based on the final episode of Carl Sagan's Cosmos, in which a mob of Christians raid the Serapeum and burn all of the scrolls in it, but leaves the building itself largely intact, aside from knocking over a few statues. In historical reality, the Serapeum probably did not have any scrolls in it at the time of its destruction, and the Christians completely demolished the building to the ground. The film also strongly implies that Hypatia is an atheist, a notion directly contradictory to the surviving sources, which all portray her as a devoted follower of the teachings of Plotinus, who taught that the goal of philosophy was a mystical union with the divine. Okay, that was a long read, and again, I'm going to apologize to anybody who heard this and found inaccuracies in the words that I said, and I do apologize about that. I am hoping that someday I'll get over all of that and be able to speak orally a lot, or read orally a lot better. So I do apologize about all that, and I hope you did enjoy the story. I think it's pretty interesting. It's been a while since I've actually read that, but reading it again, it's actually pretty good. It brings to light a lot of things, especially when it comes to her death, and then afterwards, even today, people dramatize it to the point where the story is actually being lost, and what really took place, and what's really known as fact is lost, or it's almost lost. But that's some of the things that I do like about it. And like I said before, if you guys like this story, please like, subscribe, share, make comments. I'd love to hear what you have to say. If you do make a comment, I'll do my best to respond to each and every comment as they come. Thanks for watching, and thanks for listening.